What's up, friends? It's Jimmy here, just politely reminding you to hit the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, head down to the comments section and let me know where you're listening from. It really helps my video out in the algorithm. Anyway, big thanks to everyone for watching. Now let's get down to business. In the bitter Chicago winter of December 1978, the air around 8213 West Summerdale Avenue was thick with more than just frost. For years, neighbors had complained about a foul smell they couldn't place. Now they knew why. Inside the quiet suburban home, investigators were engaged in a methodical, grim excavation trying to find remains. One by one, they emerged from the cramped crawl space, the forgotten sons, brothers, and friends who had vanished into the orbit of John Wayne Gacy. As the count climbed to a staggering 33, a second, more enduring tragedy came into focus. While some victims were quickly identified by wallets left in their pockets or by dental records, many were just skeletons, their identities seemingly erased forever. They were assigned numbers, cold designations for an unspeakable horror. This is the story of one of them. The young man known only as victim number 28, a boy who disappeared in the earliest days of Gacy's reign of terror. John Wayne Gacy was a master of the double life. In public, he was a pillar of his Norwood Park community. He was a successful contractor running his own business, an active Democratic precinct captain, and a friendly neighbor known for hosting lively parties. He was perhaps most famous for his alter ego, Pogo the Clown, performing at children's parties and charity events. This respectable facade was the perfect cover for the monster beneath. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy lured at least 33 boys and young men, ranging in age from 14 to 21, to his home. His method was a horrifyingly consistent pattern of predation. He targeted vulnerable youths, hitchhikers, runaways, boys and young men he met at bus stations, or those simply looking for a job at his construction company. Once they were at his house, he'd often use alcohol or drugs to lower their inhibitions before introducing his quote-unquote magic trick. This was a ruse that involved convincing them to put on handcuffs. Little did his victims know that once the cuffs were on, Gacy's true evil nature emerged. From there, he would commit unspeakable acts before slaying them, usually by strangulation. He buried 29 of his victims on his property, most of them crammed into the crawl space, and dumped the last 4 in a nearby river. For 6 years, his spree went unchecked, aided by a system that often dismissed the concerns of frantic parents. It wasn't until the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast in December 1978 that a determined police investigation finally led to Gacy's door. With this, the authorities would unearth the very literal graveyard he had built beneath his very own home. Pulled from the earth, Victim 28 was little more than a collection of bones and unanswered questions. Forensic analysis provided a sparse but crucial profile. He was a white male, between 14 and 18 years old at the time of his death, and stood somewhere between 5'6" and 5'11". But the most significant clue was the time frame investigators assigned to his disappearance, sometime between January 3rd, 1972, and July 31st, 1975. This places this slaying squarely in the nascent phase of Gacy's career as a predator. Gacy's first known slaying, that of 16-year-old Timothy McCoy, occurred on January 3rd, 1972. By the end of 1975, he had slain only 2 other known victims. The vast majority of his offenses, at least 30 of them, were committed after his second divorce in March 1976, when he was living alone and completely unconstrained. This early time frame is profoundly important because it means Victim 28 was slain while Gacy was still married to and living with his second wife, Carol Hoff. She was aware of the terrible smell coming from the crawl space, a stench Gacy explained away as moisture from a sewer pipe, which he attempted to mask with layers of lime and concrete. This context suggests that the attack on victim 28 had to be carried out with a greater degree of stealth than Gacy's later, more frenzied slaughter. The victim was likely someone Gacy could plausibly bring home without raising suspicion. Some investigators believe he was a runaway that was offered a job with Gacy's contracting company, a profile that fits many of his victims. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, identifying the victims was a monumental task limited by the technology of the era. Given the state of the remains, investigators relied heavily on dental records and matching X-ray records to old healed fractures on the bones. They also relied on personal effects found in Gacy's house that also led to names. But these methods were only as good as the records available, and for many families, such records were lost or non-existent. For decades, 8 of Gacy's victims remained nameless. Then, in 2011, the Cook County Sheriff reopened the cold case, determined to use modern science to finish the job his predecessors couldn't. Investigators exhumed the remains of the 8 unidentified victims to extract DNA. The effort yielded immediate, incredible results, and a number of the unknown victims were quickly identified. Unfortunately, victim 28 wasn't identified through this method, and his genetic information didn't match any known missing person reported. Synthesizing the evidence as we know it, there's a few things we can say about who this missing person was. Critically, it's almost certain he was never reported missing, or if he was, the report was lost to time or jurisdictional gaps. 2 primary theories have emerged from this. He could have been a local youth, estranged from his family due to the kind of dysfunction that might prevent a missing person report from being filed promptly, if at all. Or, like Gacy's first victim, Timothy McCoy, he could have been a traveler, a hitchhiker, or a runaway just passing through Chicago from another state. In a pre-digital world, connecting a boy who vanished in Illinois to a family searching for him in Ohio or California was a near impossible task. This young man's anonymity was his greatest vulnerability. While later victims had families who grew suspicious of Gacy and hounded the police, victim 28 disappeared without a ripple, making him the perfect prey from Gacy's perspective. In essence, his complete disconnect from any social safety net is the very reason his case remains one of the hardest to solve. The most recent breakthrough in the case came from a revolutionary new field, forensic genetic genealogy, which I believe I've mentioned on my channel once or twice. In 2021, this method was used to identify victim 5 as Francis Wayne Alexander, a young man from North Carolina who had recently moved to Chicago. The search for the identity of victim 28 and the 4 other nameless boys remains extremely important despite Gacy having been eliminated Old Yeller style in 1994. Identifying this victim, as well as the other 4, is a refusal to let one of history's worst serial predators have the final word. You're traveling alone on a dark, winding road, with only the rhythmic clopping of your horse's hooves for company. Suddenly, you hear another set of hoofbeats behind you, gaining fast. You urge your horse onward, but the sound grows louder, closer, an unnatural thunder in the quiet night. You risk a glance over your shoulder and see a towering figure on a powerful steed, matching your pace with terrifying ease. He's cloaked in shadow, but as he draws alongside you, you see the truth, a sight that freezes the blood in your veins. Where the rider's head should be, there is only an empty, ragged collar. This chilling figure, the Headless Horseman, is more than just the villain of a single ghost story. He's an ancient archetype, a phantom who has galloped through the folklore of cultures across the world for over a millennium. Long before a galloping Hessian terrorized New York's Hudson Valley, his spectral ancestors haunted the roads and moors of Europe. The archetype is not a monolith, and each culture has shaped its horsemen to reflect its deepest fears. Perhaps the most sinister of these is Ireland's Dullahan. His name means dark man in Gaelic, and he's a dark fairy from the underworld. The Dullahan rides a headless black horse and carries his own decaying head under his arm, its eyes darting about with supernatural sight to seek out its next victim. In some tales, he wields a whip made from a human spine and drives a coach constructed from bones and skin. Folklore suggests he may be the lingering spirit of the ancient Celtic god Crom Dubh, who demanded sacrifices by decapitation before the arrival of Christianity. In contrast, German folklore presents a more morally complex figure, often tied to the broader myth of the wild hunt. Germany's headless riders are frequently revenants, the ghosts of wicked men who are condemned to wander the earth until they atone for their crimes. But unlike their Celtic equivalent, these spirits aren't always malevolent, with many of them being forced to do good deeds as a form of penance. In some versions of this legend, only when they've repaid their debt to society can they be made whole again and rest peacefully. Some versions of Der Kopfloser Reiter, as they're known in German, act as supernatural guardians, sounding a hunting horn to warn travelers of impending danger. Other times they appear and scare hunters, preventing them venturing out when they believe they'll meet tragedy that day. Still other times they are sent to hound down outlaws, serving as enforcers of a moral order they defied in their own lives. The Headless Horseman rode into the American consciousness and into global fame in 1820 with Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Irving, a master storyteller, didn't invent the figure but brilliantly adapted it, creating a uniquely American ghost. While living in England, he absorbed European folklore, drawing heavily from German tales of ghostly hunters he likely learned about through his friendship with Sir Walter Scott. Irving's genius was to take this old-world phantom and anchor it in the soil and history of the New World. He set his story in the Hudson Valley, a region he knew intimately, and populated it with characters bearing the names of real local Dutch families. This led to his fiction having a chilling air of authenticity. Most importantly, Irving gave his horsemen a specific historical identity: the ghost of a Hessian trooper decapitated by a cannonball during the American Revolutionary War. The Hessians were German mercenaries hired by the British, and they were widely feared by the American colonists, making them a perfect choice for a ghost that resonated nationally. Notably, the Headless Horseman himself appears to be based in real, authentic history, as evidenced by something that happened during the Battle of White Plains in October 1776. This location, which is less than 10 miles from the real Sleepy Hollow, featured a Hessian horseman who took a cannonball straight to the dome. And spoiler alert, in case you haven't read about this battle yet, the horseman didn't make it. Irving transformed this brutal footnote into the origin story for America's greatest ghost. What makes Irving's story so enduring, however, is its profound ambiguity. He never confirms if the horseman is a genuine specter or simply Ichabod Crane's rival, the brawny Brom Bones, in a clever disguise. The discovery of a shattered pumpkin near Ichabod's abandoned hat strongly suggests a prank, though this is ultimately left fairly ambiguous. Beyond any single story, the Headless Rider haunts us because he taps into a primal and universal set of fears. At its most basic level, the horror is biological. Decapitation is an absolute, unhealable wound that severs the mind, the seat of identity, reason, and consciousness, from the body. A body that can still act, ride, and hunt without a head is a profound violation of the natural order. It represents the terrifying triumph of chaotic, mindless impulse over rational control. This perhaps taps into our deep-seated fear of losing our own minds and becoming subject to forces we can't comprehend. In this way, I personally find that it has some passing resemblance to the mythology we've built up around zombies. The Headless Horseman is a powerful and adaptable archetype all over the Western world, and scholars still struggle to identify why the archetype is so widespread. He's not one ghost, but a legion, reshaped by each culture to carry the weight of its history and its fears. In the quiet early hours of June 15th, 2008, a train thundered down the tracks in Brielle, New Jersey, only to be met with a terrifying sight: a young woman on the rails. The impact was instantly fatal, and a tragedy unfolded in this Jersey Shore town. When the sun rose, authorities were left with a haunting question: who was she? Over 17 years have passed since that night, yet the woman struck by the New Jersey Transit train remains unidentified. Dubbed the Monmouth County Jane Doe, her case has become one of New Jersey's enduring mysteries. Shortly after 1:30 a.m. on June 15, 2008, police were alerted that a pedestrian had been hit by a train near the Fisk Avenue crossing in Brielle. The location was just south of the Manasquan station, along a stretch of track bordering a residential area. The victim was pronounced dead at the scene, a white female with no identification on her. Investigators couldn't immediately determine if this was a horrific accident or whether the entire thing was intentional, as there were no witnesses aside from the train crew. What they did know was that the young woman's life had ended on the tracks that rainy night, and no one stepped forward to claim her in the aftermath. Over the following days, an autopsy and forensic examination were conducted. Despite the violent nature of the incident, the woman's face was completely recognizable, which gave hope that someone might identify her quickly. Authorities circulated sketches and descriptions to the public, hoping a friend or family member might recognize the young woman. Despite this, though, absolutely no one came forward. Investigators carefully documented the Jane Doe's physical characteristics and belongings, piecing together clues about her life. She was estimated to be somewhere between her late teens and late 20s. She stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed roughly 120 pounds, and had neck-length brown hair and blue-gray eyes. She also had a distinctive scar indicating that she underwent an appendectomy surgery. However, due to the extreme force of the collision, it wasn't clear whether there were other distinctive marks which were missed. Crucially, what the Jane Doe was wearing and carrying provided a vivid snapshot of her circumstances. She was dressed in multiple layers, possibly for warmth, or possibly because she was homeless, or living a transient lifestyle. But more on that in a moment. Around her neck, she had a blue rosary-style bead necklace with a cross pendant, and on her wrist, she was wearing a wooden bracelet featuring images of Catholic saints. Unless this was a gift from a friend, this narrows down her identity somewhat. Most intriguingly, the Jane Doe had a brown tote bag with her, emblazoned with the words, New York. Inside this bag was an assortment of personal belongings, almost like a travel kit or a mobile wardrobe, which offers a poignant glimpse into her life. Personally, I think that based on the evidence as it stands, there's virtually no chance that she wasn't homeless. That said, I suppose she could have also been hitchhiking, but I don't think people really did that in 2008. But feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. She had no form of identification, no phone, no wallet on her, just these personal items. To investigators, this raised the likelihood that she was far from home and estranged from people who would immediately miss her. As of 2025, It's reported that the Monmouth County Jane Doe's case is undergoing forensic genetic genealogy testing. This means that unless she was adopted, the authorities should now be able to resolve her case in the near future and restore her identity. As for whether she did this act herself or whether she was a victim of an accident, this too also remains unsolved. Some have speculated that given that she was likely a practicing Catholic, that this may have been accidental, or at least staged by her to look accidental. Hey everyone, Jimmy here, reminding you to like and subscribe and tap the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to hit that join button or follow the Patreon link if you want to just tip or get your name up on the shout-out screen. Picture an ocean so vast and terrifying that it was known as the Sea of Darkness throughout the medieval Islamic world. To the medieval mind, this was the Atlantic, a churning, fog-shrouded void at the edge of the known world. While scholars in Baghdad or Damascus might write of the Atlantic with a sense of distant dread, for the people of Al-Andalus, it was totally different. It was their western frontier, a source of livelihood for fishermen, a trade route for acquiring tin from Britain, and a battleground where their navies clashed with Viking raiders. The Sea of Darkness was, for them, a familiar, if formidable, neighbor. It's from this world that a once popular, but now virtually unknown story of a pre-Columbian transatlantic voyage emerged. The tale concerns a man named Kash ibn Sa'id ibn Asawad, a Moorish navigator from the vibrant heart of Al-Andalus. In the year 889, Kash allegedly gathered a crew of young men, provisioned a ship, and steered it west, directly into the heart of the unknown ocean. More astonishingly, the story claims that after a long time, he returned. This single fleeting account raises the question of whether this navigator from Iberia crossed the Atlantic in the 9th century, 600 years before Columbus. To understand if a voyage like Kash's was even possible, we have to look at the world he came from. 9th century Al-Andalus was one of the most advanced societies in the world. Its capital, Cordoba, was a sprawling metropolis known as the ornament of the world, a beacon of learning and culture. Cordoba was a city of paved streets, public baths, and magnificent libraries, most famously the library of Caliph al-Hakam II, which reportedly held hundreds of thousands of volumes. This was a place where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars collaborated, translating and building upon the great scientific and philosophical works of the ancient world. This intense intellectual curiosity, this drive to map the world and understand its mechanics, provided a powerful motive for exploration. This motive was matched by sophisticated means. Andalusian maritime technology was state-of-the-art. Sailors had perfected navigational instruments like the astrolabe, a device inherited from the Greeks that could determine latitude by measuring the altitude of stars. They also developed tools like the kamal, an Arab invention from the late 9th century, specifically designed for celestial navigation at sea. Their ships were advanced, often featuring triangular sails that allowed them to tack against the wind far more effectively than the square-rigged vessels common elsewhere. Shipbuilders were also moving toward more advanced hulls, where planks were fitted edge to edge over a frame, creating sleeker, more maneuverable ships. However, that said, these ships were still a far cry from the ships Columbus would sail across the Atlantic over half a millennium later. This technological prowess was also hardened by an arms race. Al-Andalus was under constant threat from Viking raiders. The entire story of Kash rests on a single paragraph in a monumental work of history and geography, The Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems. Its author was Abu al-Masudi, a brilliant and widely traveled scholar of the 10th century. His work blended together documented history with geography, social commentary, and compelling anecdotes and folklore. In a section discussing the Atlantic, al-Masudi reports that adventurers have braved the ocean, some perishing and others returning. He then provides a specific example. He identifies a man named Cash Cash, an inhabitant of Cordoba, who assembled a group of young men from his city and embarked on a voyage. He specifies that the expedition set sail from the port of what is now Palos de la Frontera. In a somewhat bizarre historical twist, and one that supporters of the plausibility of this mention, is that this is the very same port Columbus would later use. After a long absence, the crew returned with a ship loaded with fabulous booty, and he told of a place that translates from Arabic as unknown land. He then specified that this is a common story told in Andalusia, and says that everyone there, regardless of their religion or background, knows about this story. This final line is perhaps the most historically significant part of the account. It suggests that, regardless of whether the voyage actually happened as described, the story of the voyage was a real and popular piece of 10th century Andalusian culture. The legend itself is a historical artifact, revealing a society that saw itself as capable of conquering the great unknown ocean to its west. The modern debate over Cash Cash hinges not just on the account itself, but on how it has been translated and interpreted. One reading of the account suggests that it isn't even supposed to be taken literally, that this is in essence just a historian relating folklore. In essence, this argument boils down to the portion of the text, which almost reads like starting an English story with "once upon a time." That said, there are other modern historians who challenge whether this phrase had this sort of meaning in al-Masudi's time. As for whether Cash Cash got to North America, the short answer is that there's simply no proof. The story itself doesn't even speak of the specific nature of the lands this supposed explorer found, just that they were rich. The gold standard for establishing pre-Columbian transoceanic contact is tangible, verifiable archaeological evidence. The Norse presence in North America around 1000 is accepted as fact because of the extensive archaeological site at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland. This site undoubtedly contains the remains of their buildings and artifacts, making it impossible to dispute that they were there. The Cash Cash story, compelling as it is, has nothing comparable. There are no 9th century Andalusian artifacts in the Americas, and no American crops or goods in the archaeological record of 9th century Spain. Perhaps most strikingly, there are no other contemporary texts to corroborate al-Masudi's single account. Andalusia had a surprisingly literate culture for a 9th century civilization, and it personally strikes me as unlikely that this event wouldn't have been recorded. It also seems unlikely to me that Islamic Spain, facing a long process of reconquest over the centuries, never decided to send an expedition to find this rich overseas area. Other skeptics believe that the journey wasn't westward, but rather southward past Cape Bojador, the traditional edge of the navigable world. This would place his voyage on par with the earlier voyage of my boy, Hano the Navigator, or the later Portuguese Prince Henry, also nicknamed the Navigator. Notably, this would have provided a much more accessible source of gold and other riches that would have been very rare to completely unknown in Andalusia and in Europe more broadly. Supporters of the theory rest their case on the credibility of al-Masudi and the proven technological capacity of Andalusian sailors. However, without physical evidence, the claim remains firmly in the realm of speculation. Further, there's always the possibility that even if he did sail westward, that he may have run into other Atlantic islands, most likely the Azores, which was then uninhabited. Whether fact or a legend born from a historian's quill or something in between, the tale of the navigator from Cordoba remains a fascinating, unsolved mystery. On a December morning in 1991, A hiker in Florida's Seminole State Forest followed drag marks off a trail and found what he first thought was a discarded mannequin's leg. When he got a little bit closer, he realized that he had found the victim of a horrific crime. This person, later nicknamed the Lake County Jane Doe by the authorities, had been subject to the worst forms of assault and then eliminated. Disturbingly, while the perpetrator was theoretically brought to justice, to this day, no one knows her identity. On December 7th, 1991, the woman's body was found partially buried under tree branches in a wooded area about 75 yards off a road in Sorrento, Lake County, Florida. The perp had attempted to conceal her with brush, and the brutality of the attack was evident from her injuries. Indeed, evidence suggested this monster had even stabbed her in the neck with a broken glass bottle, in addition to strangling her. The remote location and lack of any identification made the investigation difficult from the start, leaving authorities with a tragic crime, but no name for the victim and no immediate suspects. Police determined that the Jane Doe was a white female likely between about 25 and 40 years old. She stood around 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed roughly 125 pounds, with shoulder-length brown hair that bleached blonde at the ends and hazel eyes. Medical examination showed she had given birth to at least one child in her life. There was also coke found in her system, and investigators noted her legs were particularly muscular. This led to speculation that she might have worked as a dancer in an adult club, or that she may have been a former athlete. When discovered, she was wearing a red hooded sweatshirt, a white blouse, and a single white sock. A distinctive piece of jewelry was found with her, a gold dangling earring featuring stars and hearts. Also, heads up, if you're one of those people who just watches, I've put this earring up on screen. Unfortunately, I could only find a black and white photograph of this earring, but I figured it was worth showing anyway, given how unique it looks. Detectives hoped that this unusual earring or details like her prior orthodontic dental work might trigger someone's memory, but no matches turned up in any missing person reports. Her fingerprints and later her DNA were entered into national databases, yet nothing led to an identification in those early years. For several years, the case stagnated with no leads on the victim's name or the perpetrator. The breakthrough came in 1995, thanks to forensic DNA technology that was just beginning to revolutionize cold cases. Biological material recovered from the crime scene had been preserved and analyzed, and in February 1995, it produced a match in Florida's then-new DNA database. The profile identified Joseph Algernon Roll, a 29-year-old local man from the Sorrento area. Roll was a convict with a history of violent attacks that fit the profile of what was done to the Jane Doe, which immediately made him the prime suspect. In fact, he had recently served a short prison term for a 1992 essay and was known for a pattern of choking or threatening his victims. At the time, using a DNA databank to crack a case was cutting edge, and Florida's database contained only a few thousand profiles. This hit was considered a major stroke of luck and a landmark moment for the investigation. The Lake County Jane Doe became one of the first cases in the state solved by a DNA match to a convicted offender. After DNA tied Roll to the crime, he was arrested and charged with the offense against the unknown woman. In 1996, he faced a jury trial in Lake County. The DNA evidence firmly placed him at the scene and proved what he had done. Prosecutors also attempted to introduce testimony from 2 other women who said Roll had committed horrific acts to them in the past, highlighting his violent modus operandi. The jury ultimately found Roll guilty of the indecent assault, but lacking certainty that he was the one who committed the actual slaying, they acquitted him of that charge. Despite that split verdict, the judge delivered a severe sentence. Citing Roll's dangerous history, the court gave him life in prison for the conviction. To this day, Roll maintains that he didn't know the victim beyond what he claims was a consensual encounter. Thankfully, he remains behind bars for life, ensuring no further harm can be done. With the likely perpetrator locked up, investigators never lost sight of the remaining question of who this Jane Doe is. In 2025, the authorities confirmed that her case was sent out for genetic genealogical testing, which ought to provide some further answers about her identity. Queen Nefertiti remains one of ancient Egypt's most iconic and mysterious figures. Over 3,300 years ago, she ruled alongside Pharaoh Akhenaten during the 18th dynasty, an era of great opulence and religious upheaval. Her name, which means the beautiful one has come, is perhaps fitting. A famous painted bust, discovered in 1912, immortalized her striking features and cemented her status as a global symbol of beauty and power millennia after her death. Historically, though, Nefertiti wasn't only celebrated for her looks. She was the great royal wife of Akhenaten and played a pivotal role in a revolutionary experiment in monotheism. Together, the royal couple upended centuries of tradition by elevating the sun disk, Aten, as the sole god, dismantling the old worship of Amun and other deities. Nefertiti has become particularly fascinating as she's depicted in contemporary artwork participating in rituals and smiting enemies, scenes typically reserved for pharaohs. Some scholars believe she wielded power in her own right, alongside Akhenaten, and may have even ruled independently for a brief period after his death. In fact, famed Egyptologist Zahi Hawass and others suggest Nefertiti assumed a pharaoh's title during the turbulent transition following Akhenaten's reign. This theory, while not universally accepted, demonstrates Nefertiti's unique status in this royal system. By the time young Tutankhamun took the throne, Nefertiti had vanished from the record. How and when she perished remains unknown, and her tomb has likely never been found. Around the 12th to 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti seemingly fades from history. Records of her death are non-existent, and contemporaries left no clear indication of where she was buried. The royal family at that time was based in the new capital Akhetaten, modern Amarna, where Akhenaten built a grand city and a royal tomb in the desert cliffs. It's possible Nefertiti was meant to be interred at Amarna, but archaeologists have no evidence of her burial in the Amarna royal tomb. In later years, her son-in-law, King Tut, moved the court back to Thebes, and the Aten worship era was declared heresy. Subsequent pharaohs attempted to erase the entire Aten episode from history. Statues were smashed, and names and images of Akhenaten and Nefertiti were chiseled out, and the heretic queen was virtually wiped from the official record. This systematic erasure was so effective that Nefertiti's legacy lay in obscurity until modern archaeology rediscovered traces of her life. But it also means clues to her death and burial were deliberately obscured. While the mummies of many 18th dynasty royals have been identified, Nefertiti's remains have never been conclusively found. In recent years, one leading hypothesis captured worldwide attention: the idea that Nefertiti's tomb might be hidden within or directly adjacent to King Tut's tomb. This theory was most prominently championed by British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves. In 2015, Reeves announced that high-resolution laser scans of the tomb walls revealed something fascinating. There were subtle fissures and outlines, suggesting two sealed doorways behind the plastered and painted surfaces. One of these hidden doorways, he proposed, could lead to an unexplored storage chamber, and the other could be the entrance to Nefertiti's lost burial chamber. Reeves pointed out that Tut's tomb is unusually small for a pharaoh and appears to have a layout suitable for a queen's burial. This implied the young king may have been interred in an antechamber of an existing tomb originally made for Nefertiti. He also noted peculiarities in the tomb's artwork. The painted figures on the north wall depict his successor performing funerary rites. He suggested they seemed to have been altered from earlier depictions of the pharaoh performing those rites for his predecessor. In other words, Reeves argued that the scene was initially meant to show Tut burying Nefertiti, and only later was it modified to show the next pharaoh burying Tut. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities took Reeves's theory seriously enough to authorize a series of investigations. In 2015 and 2016, teams conducted ground-penetrating radar scans inside Tut's tomb to detect voids or passages behind the walls. An initial scan by a Japanese specialist appeared to support the existence of hidden cavities. However, a follow-up scan funded by National Geographic was negative, finding no clear anomalies. To resolve the conflicting results, a third, more comprehensive radar survey was conducted in 2017 and 2018 by independent experts. In the words of one report, the high-confidence conclusion was that no hidden chambers adjacent to Tutankhamun's tomb exist. These findings tempered the excitement, and many archaeologists grew skeptical that Nefertiti lies behind Tut's painted walls. Interestingly, the story didn't end there. In 2020, another twist emerged when a former Egyptian antiquities minister led a high-tech radar survey of the broader area around the tomb. This team detected what appeared to be an unknown corridor and a large chamber a few meters north of the tomb. The discovery was leaked, and it was suggested that there may be a hidden 32-foot wide chamber. As of yet, that subsurface anomaly hasn't been excavated or confirmed to be a tomb, so it remains an intriguing possibility. Meanwhile, Reeves added new evidence to his theory in 2022 by identifying previously overlooked hieroglyphic traces on Tutankhamun's tomb paintings. He claimed that inscriptions naming King Tut were painted over earlier ones that named Nefertiti, implying the space originally belonged to her. The enduring mystery of Nefertiti's tomb has given rise to a range of speculative theories, some more plausible than others. One persistent idea is that Nefertiti was buried at Amarna and later moved. If she died during Akhenaten's reign, she might have originally been interred in the Amarna royal tomb, along with her daughter Meketaten, who died young and was definitely buried there. When Tut abandoned Amarna, loyalists could have taken Nefertiti's remains out and reburied her quietly in Thebes to protect her from desecration. In this scenario, her tomb in Amarna may have been destroyed or left empty. Supporting this, archaeologists at Amarna found fragments of royal coffins and equipment that hint some mummies were relocated. However, no inscription explicitly naming Nefertiti has surfaced there, and so this theory remains circumstantial. Another theory suggests that Nefertiti might have a tomb in the Valley of the Queens, or another part of the Theban hills. As the principal wife of a pharaoh, she could have been buried in a separate royal wife's tomb, rather than the main Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Queens, where queens of later dynasties were buried, has been explored, but many tombs there were heavily looted. Meanwhile, Zahi Hawass has been actively pursuing a different angle in an attempt to crack this case. Hawass has for years led a project re-examining unidentified mummies from the late 18th dynasty using modern DNA analysis. In particular, 2 mummified women from tomb KV-21 have drawn attention. Located in the Valley of the Kings, KV-21 contained 2 female bodies, designated KV-21A and KV-21B, that were poorly preserved. Preliminary DNA tests a decade ago hinted that KV-21A might be the mother of the 2 infant daughters of Tutankhamun found in his tomb. This suggested KV-21A could be Ankhesenamun, who was Nefertiti's daughter, as well as King Tut's wife? If so, it stands to reason that the other mummy, KV-21b, found alongside her could be Queen Nefertiti herself. Nefertiti was believed to be somewhere around 45 years old when she dropped off the historical record. Interestingly, experts who have analyzed KV-21b concluded that she was about 45 years old at the time of her death. Unfortunately, the DNA sample that was initially taken was too degraded to yield any usable data at the time. In the intervening years, however, scientists have made rapid progress in the ability to analyze DNA from degraded samples. Hawass announced in 2022 that his team had obtained new samples from KV-21b and other remains and would soon be in the position to reveal results. He confidently stated that by comparing the genetic profiles of known mummies, like Akhenaten and other relatives, they expect to name Nefertiti's mummy at last. At present, the results of this testing hasn't been released to the public, and it's unclear if the current samples taken yielded usable DNA evidence. At any rate, if Zahi Hawass is correct, Nefertiti's mummy may already have been discovered, and perhaps the mystery is just awaiting DNA confirmation. That would solve one piece of the puzzle, her physical remains, but not necessarily pinpoint the location of her original tomb. If 21b is in fact Nefertiti, it's not entirely clear whether the KV-21 tomb site was her initial burial site, or a later place her body was moved to by loyalists. The tomb is generally viewed as lacking sufficient grandeur for someone of Nefertiti's status, suggesting that there may be a more significant site that has yet to be discovered.